Well, hello again. My name is Carrie, and today we are going to talk about the mysterious art of storyboarding, specifically for motion graphics, but inevitably it'll apply to, more general uses of storyboarding. So this one's going to be a lot shorter than that monstrous first thing about building a reel, and hopefully it'll be a little better each time we do one of these. Maybe a touch more professional, perhaps. Although, I guess it'd help if you'd go ahead and imagine that I'm not actually just sitting here in my underwear. So if you've got that under control, let's go ahead and take a look at some examples of storyboards from various designers that I gathered up quickly. And let's also hope that they don't mind us gawking at their beautiful work, because I didn't ask any of them. We'll briefly talk about what storyboarding is, and then we'll go through the process of making some storyboards, which I don't think I've ever actually seen anyone do, so I guess you could watch me fail at that. Alright, so I just drank a bunch of milk, which was a really stupid idea, but let's start off with the question, what's a storyboard really? So standard storyboarding in motion graphics isn't the same as storyboarding for film. In film, the storyboards are typically sketched to indicate what the camera will be looking at and doing, and what's happening to major elements in the frame, like actors or whatever. There's usually a sketch for each shot, and sometimes for significant actions that happen within the shot, and they're fairly loose drawings. But motion graphic storyboards are typically a series of fully realized images, not only suggesting what's happening in the frame at some given time, but also exactly what it will look like in that moment. So as a designer, you're coming up with the visual concept based on some kind of brief, and then gathering and preparing and creating elements and composing frames that look like final executions and that tell the story as a series of moments. Now that's a lot to ask one person to do in the span of a few days, so both the quality of the idea and the quality of its execution in a storyboard can really set designers apart. So then you might ask, why do storyboarding and pre-planning? Well, if you're boarding for a studio, from the business perspective, production takes a long time and a lot of effort, and that means money. So we have a storyboard that acts as a plan that can be executed, which gives the business end a way to estimate the time and effort, and therefore the money that it will take. Now from the client's perspective, they're about to buy a custom product that they haven't even seen yet. It's totally untested and has never been made before. So having a better idea of what they're buying and why is obviously a huge plus for them. The final execution may end up being considerably different from the original storyboards because, a lot of people may touch it along the way, but at the very least, the storyboard's kind of proof of concept for a client. But more interestingly, a fully realized storyboard can serve to inspire the client to get behind something they might never have been willing to or ever conceived of until they'd seen it. Many clients come already bearing ideas about execution and so forth, but clients are coming to us to visually communicate to and inspire their audience because we're a lot better at it than they are. Just like they're probably vastly better at building airplanes or growing strawberries or whatever it is that they do that we don't. If they knew how to make a compelling commercial for themselves or really attractive and intriguing kiosk graphics or what have you, they'd probably do it, but they don't. And so they're coming to us looking for our input and expertise. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't know what they need, but it may mean that if you present something they hadn't considered or imagined, and which is truly inspiring to them and their audience, then you've absolutely created value for them where none existed before, and you've created value for their audience, and that's huge. So if you can generate enthusiasm and understanding in a client just by making some proof of concept images, it's absolutely worth it. Now, the advantages of this also apply when you're inspired to do your own project. So although you may think you have an idea to move forward with at the start of a project, a storyboard really helps you to start figuring out where the holes in your idea are. A lot of times it turns out that an exciting idea is mostly vapor until we're challenged to lay that idea out concretely, and then you realize, oh yeah, there's a shit ton of holes I have to fill in, or more often it's like, oh crap, this isn't an idea, it's just a vague image in my head. So part of the storyboarding process is about play and about giving yourself a format to work out some ideas and make them visual, and therefore make them concrete. Maybe the process of animating or going through production-like routines like playing with color or working out an effect is part of your exploration and play, but storyboarding is still a great tool to start nailing down things like narrative, pacing, composition before you're, ass deep in production and realize the thing you're making makes no sense. The type of storyboarding you do can depend on what needs to be explored. So some of the frames we're looking at here are more like style frames than storyboard frames, meaning that they're more concerned with describing the visual language and attitude than they are with dictating a specific sequence of events. Sometimes designers will create longboards, which are more like a collage of moments mashed together into one large impressionistic image, and sometimes they'll create many frames to very specifically indicate what happens first, second, etc. The frames may indicate hard cuts between shots or transitions between ideas, whatever the project calls for. Now, how you know what a project calls for is really a larger question of design. Typically, you're given a brief by a client stating what the goals of the project are, the format, the audience, the point of the thing. It might be really specific, or it might be really general, relying on you to creatively meet or exceed the needs of the project. So your job can end up involving all kinds of disciplines in meeting those needs, including branding and storytelling and visual communication, which in itself can mean the concerns of composition and typography and lighting and modeling and illustration and photography and collage and so forth. Now that we've looked at some examples, I want to actually go through the process of creating storyboards for a real client. So the project we're going to work with was started when I was contacted by a friend, an old classmate of mine, Rafi Simonian, some of whose boards we just looked at, and who heads a studio called Now. And his client, Fox Sports, wanted Now to pitch some frames for a spot that would highlight the new NASCAR season. So Fox Sports has its own really great internal design studio, so they have a pretty good sense of what they need design-wise. But when they sent these references for structure and tone, I had to think, they're going to an outside studio to get additional input and probably a different perspective. So I should bear these spots in mind, but try to give them something they don't have yet. So the first thing I did was to start rummaging through imagery to generate some vague ideas for what might qualify as a new perspective on NASCAR that still complements what they've been looking at and thinking about. This one is this insane metaphor of the cars as jet fighters racing to the track. They're transforming and smashing each other, and it even looks like some of the drivers are robots. It's like a huge action movie mashup, and I don't want to give them more of that or try to compete with it. So I immediately start looking in this other direction. I'm looking at low-tech photography, double exposure stuff, some simpler, more graphic compositions, and thinking to myself, so is there enough power in sort of the other end of this, in mystery and in quiet, to convey something really interesting about a motorsport that still involves multi-ton vehicles thundering around at 200 miles per hour? Well, I don't know. I'm going to have to give it a try. Now, this project came with a really open brief, which isn't always the case. Sometimes a client comes asking for something really specific, and they mostly want you to visualize it. But in this case, there was really an opportunity to create something from scratch, or tell a new story, or try something fresh. But not a lot of time to figure that out. So I started doing research on this kind of racing and what's appealing about it while collecting some potential imagery to work with. You always want to be grabbing stuff you may want later because there's no time to go back and find that awesome thing that you passed over. And the better your source materials are, the more potential your project has to turn out well. But at this point, I'm not really sure what the project is, so grabbing lots of what ifs is okay too, as source or for ideas. Now, the brief asked for a modular package for generating interest in the new NASCAR season on Fox Sports. Now, modular package meaning give us something we can edit or insert footage into and that we can make several spots from. So it could be a system of mortices or interstitials or some interesting way to contain swappable footage, or it could be more narrative as long as the parts of the narrative can be mixed and matched. So we'll want to appeal to NASCAR fans, but of course also try to engage potential viewers who may not be aware of the upcoming season. And that's basically it for the brief. So what we're looking at now is mostly a process of familiarizing and testing some materials. I was given 2 3D models of actual stock cars, which I believe were purchased from a professional modeler, so they're an example of starting out with good source material. But the first thing we're going to do with them is to try some stuff and probably fail. The point here is that We all kind of have things we're comfortable making or doing, but if we keep doing just the things we're comfortable with, we end up with a bunch of the same stuff over and over, and that gets pretty boring for you, for your client, and for your audience. So we have to spend some time trying things we're interested in but unsure of. And when you try something out, several things can happen. Maybe it doesn't work at all, or maybe it mostly doesn't work, but something you didn't expect accidentally happens in the meantime and leads you down a new path. Or maybe it all just falls into place like magic and you're set. Most of the time, though, the value is in the happy accident, and that comes down to you recognizing the potential in a thing when you see it. So here, I'm thinking about one of the references I was interested in and trying to see if I can make NASCAR-related imagery with the same mood as that reference in order to see if that goes anywhere. Now, it looks kind of cool, but it's not jogging my head in any particular way that might satisfy the brief. So I'm setting it aside to do the same thing with this helmet model while referencing some of these other images that I pulled. Now, I'm not sure how to make this kind of imagery, so I'm going to give it a shot and see if I can make it work. And maybe it leads to something. Maybe a story comes out of it, or maybe a visual system that I can build out, or maybe it leads off in another direction entirely. I don't know. But it's worth exploring my initial instincts about these more photographic process references, either to explore the vague ideas I had at the start, or to allow it to take me somewhere new. When you have a bit of time, it can be a big advantage to work in this kind of organic way, where you're making things and discovering how they might apply to your project along the way. And if you're paying attention, those discoveries usually happen, and when they don't, you can always fall back on what you know. But in playing with these particular elements and trying to find something compelling about NASCAR, I got to this point where I had cut this guy out and darkened him up to try to make him kind of a mysterious figure. And I thought about backlighting him, maybe against the floodlights of a night race. But when I pulled this image of the stands and the floodlights, I thought, I can reduce this down to just the driver in his element, the racetrack, and that's sort of more compelling. I could strip away the crowds and all that crap. And it could just be the guy backlit against the track lighting, so he's not any one particular person, it's just the idea of the driver. And then I thought, well, that's cooler, and the lights are a cool element. I'm abstracting the driver, and I bet I can abstract the track imagery down to just the lights and still convey something interesting. So I pulled these fluorescent lights and worked up something simple and clean. Then I did the same for the helmet I'd worked with earlier, and that got me thinking of doing these separate shots or vignettes of racing-related objects in these backlit scenarios. And that in turn led me to thinking, okay, I'll do the cars too, but I really need to get some action in here. So how do I apply this idea to the cars racing around? I could actually build a track out of lights and have them running around it. So now I've got the seed of an idea. It's simplistic and it needs some more work, but there seems to be something compelling in presenting a rough story this way, and I'm kind of excited that the ideas are flowing more readily now. So that kind of brings us to details. Now, I think anyone who makes beautiful, compelling stuff will probably tell you that in the process of making it, they're thinking about the big picture while thinking about the details at the same time. Now, the big picture is really just what someone understands from looking at all the details. You take away the details and what do you have left? Nothing. There's nothing left to look at or read, so you'd have no picture. Now, the process of figuring out the big picture is also the process of figuring out its details. So you start asking questions, and the first question you ask is, what is the big picture here? Okay, well, big picture is vignettes of backlit racing objects. Alright, well that's super vague, so what's an example of one of these vignettes? Well, one could be stock cars battling at night around a track made of light. Okay, well that's still pretty vague, so we keep asking questions to get more specific, like, what kind of light is this track made of? Well, it's not going to be something fancy, because part of NASCAR's appeal is that it's rough and ready. It's a lot of power cobbled together through low-tech means, so we're probably not talking about something that looks too high-tech, but it could still look sleek. So how about we use fluorescent tubes? Great! Should we stand them on their ends, or have the cars driving over them, or what? Alright, well, if you look at pictures of real tracks like this one, they have these walls with fencing made of cables, and we could reference that structure. Okay, cool. So they're suspended between these posts. Are they dirty with like sparking wires hanging between them, and like some of them are dead? Well, we could do that, but just because we talked about low tech doesn't mean we want uncared for or sloppy or decaying, because NASCAR isn't like Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. In fact, it might be nice to keep it clean and minimalist. And then, as a bonus, we can convey the intensity of the battle by having the roar of the cars destroy some of the pristine bulbs as they thunder by. And now there's a real reason for the lights to be there, as opposed to just being a constant visual element. So now, that's an example of how the basic story has informed our thinking about the details, and at a certain point, a thought about figuring out the details has actually informed the story. So we asked the story what details it needed, and as the details evolved in response, they came back and suggested interesting things to the story. Now we've got a more specific and engaged story as a result, and that'll go on to tell us more specific things about what details we might need. So now I realize I need a few frames to convey this story of cars racing down a pristine track and destroying it in their fury. And I also realize that this story about the destruction of the backlighting could bleed over into the other vignettes to create a stronger relationship between them. And of course that means changing or introducing new details into some of the other images, and maybe in doing so that'll suggest something more to the story, and so on, and it's back and forth. Now, we're making something kind of minimalist, meaning that there's intentionally not a wealth of detail. There could be all kinds of additional details and effects, night sky, stadium details, tarmac, more cars in the distance, tents and pit crews, and the whole mobile circus that follows racing events, screaming fans, billboards, blimps, clouds. We could put all kinds of camera imperfections like lens distortion and chromatic aberration and extra optical muck and on. But I felt like this idea needed simplicity. It needed to stay relatively stripped down. That the idea would actually gain power if it could differentiate itself from the photoreal jet fighter reference and the fanfare of that football spot we looked at. So if this idea is chosen to move forward into production, then all kinds of things are likely to change. But when you're pitching, you're trying to convey the idea in a way that sells it to the client. So I wanted it to stand out, and do so by being more graphic, more purely compositional, less cluttered with stuff. I wanted it a little raw and stark. It'd still have drama and interest, but visually it would stick out a bit against the other stuff on TV. And it remains to be seen whether this will work out in the end, but the point is that we're going for minimalist, so more isn't necessarily better. What this does mean is that the details that are there are all that much more important, because since they're the only things on the page, there won't be much else to distract someone's eye from scrutinizing them. So the elements need to be all that much more cared for. But it's important to note that this is actually true in a more general sense, which reinforces the idea that it's exceedingly important to work with great source material if you want something great in the end. Whether that's found imagery or something you photographed or illustrated or a model you're working with, you always want it to be excellent in and of itself. You're using it as the foundation of a house you're trying to build. And if the foundation sucks, the house is going to suck. No amount of cheap paint and discount spackle and cover-up materials will change that either. And imperfect elements you try to use in the making of a composition are going to require lots of Photoshop touch-ups. And the more Photoshop glue you slather on it, the more Photoshopped the imagery tends to look, and frankly, the longer it takes you to do all that work. So, despite the fact that it may take you longer to find or create the right things that you need for your image, you're probably still going to save yourself time in the construction phase, and you're going to end up with a better finished product if you invest in curating your elements. So you can see how all of the references that were pulled and the first images that were made were really part of a brainstorming process. Now, none of those images particularly worked, but working on them gave me a way to kind of bang around with some of the vague notions that I had about the project. Namely that there's something dramatic and compelling about racing, and about the culture of NASCAR in specific, but that I wanted to stay away from the sort of fantastical VFX heavy territory that had already been covered. Now, my initial impulse was to steer away from that territory by moving in a specific visual direction, which is a pretty common impulse for visual people, right? But honestly, defining a visual strategy or a look before you really understand what it is that you're making is usually a losing tactic, because you end up trying to shoehorn ideas into that look to make something of it, and it usually doesn't make for a good fit. In this case, starting out with a visual strategy in mind worked as a way to brainstorm, but only because I was willing to let that initial visual inspiration go entirely once I found something I felt was appropriate. Now, in order to make that newer and more appropriate set of ideas work in a compelling way, there are a few things that had to happen. One, I had to strip out everything that wasn't essential, leaving just the main elements, so I could get to the core of the idea and explore that. Now, Hemingway is quoted as having said, write the story, take out all the good lines, and see if it still works. Now, that sounds like advice for writers, but what it is advice for storytellers. And if anything is true about storyboarding, it's that it's about storytelling. It's visual storytelling. And the good lines in your imagery are the fancy but kind of unnecessary elements, like, whizzy particles or sparkles or whatever bull crap you're putting in there because the frame doesn't feel interesting enough. It's lipstick on the pig. And I'm absolutely guilty of having put a lot of lipstick on a lot of pigs, but ideally, you want to recognize what's going to make for compelling ideas and a compelling story, and then let the visuals grow out of that, and as a result of that. As opposed to, flinging around your mad Photoshop skills and then trying to cram some ideas into your pretty pictures as a way to justify why you made them. Now, I say this as someone who's still learning that lesson. But that said, the second thing I needed to do was to make sure that each composition was then doing as much as it could to be beautiful and engaging while telling that story as well as possible. The kind of stuff we're asked to make in this industry is typically really short form, so we don't have a lot of time to make an impression, and it's also, it's not necessarily something our audience has intentionally chosen to watch, like in the case of commercials, so it helps give them something to get them interested. Making something visually intriguing or beautiful is a quick way to, engage an audience, not to mention giving them something that they value, which is, maybe a touch of awe or inspiration. So in each of these frames, I'm working out how to present that story in a compelling way, but doing so through compositions that are hopefully dynamic and visually engaging. So hopefully we've done that, because by this point, we're getting close to finishing. We've got a fairly well worked out idea, the frames feel cohesive and consistent as if they belong together, and we have a story worked out well enough to know what holes are left to fill in. So at this point I'm thinking it would be cool if we feature these individual shots like the helmet and driver and intersperse the racing shots amongst them and use those racing shots as a through line that we keep returning to. So we cut away from the cars and come back to them in the sequence. Now to convey that in the storyboard, we need to reorder the frames and add a few more. Probably have another one at the start when everything's pristine, and then another one near the end with more destruction. I thought a wheel would work well as another symbol, so I spent the time to find the right wheel and build out a frame that belongs somewhere in the middle of this set. I think this one fits fairly well between the first and second racing shots to break those up. So let's take a look at that in the sequence. Now here's the wheel shot. I put it between the first and second racing shots. And I think that serves to break that sequence up a bit, both for pacing and so that we're not just seeing this as one big chunk. But then also after we understand that this destruction is happening, then I inserted the wheel again. I pushed in a bit on it and put in some of this destruction that we're seeing in the original driver shot. Now I had also wanted to put a new intro shot in here, which I think was a good idea because this image kind of starts to depict the mood of the rest of the spot and is a nice intro because we see this mysterious character and introduces some of the elements we're going to see. And also I think it sort of starts off the series in a quiet way so that then when the destruction starts happening, there's a definite contrast. So the question now is, does this fulfill the brief? And I think it does, but in an unexpected way, which may be better still. The brief asked for a modular package to get people interested in NASCAR on Fox. This board is a suggestion of a series of relatively disconnected shots, all describing a basic narrative. But those shots are swappable, and many more shots in the same vein could be added. So for each spot that they want to make in this campaign, they can kind of mix and match to keep it interesting while intercutting their own footage. And I think that the imagery has the sense of drama that they were looking for, but instead of action excitement, we have kind of sexy excitement, which is a new but still valid way to show the appeal of NASCAR. Alright, so let's have a quick recap. We just talked about a few strategies for making stuff, which of course isn't exhaustive because there's plenty more to consider, but hopefully some of these are helpful to keep in mind. First, take the time to experiment and fail. This does a lot of things for you. It helps you start working out your initial ideas. It allows you, in the long run, to help expand your own skill set. And the process of trying something may present things to you that you probably haven't considered. You're going to fail sometimes anyway, so get at it and use it to your advantage. And that leads us to the second point, which is be open to what those failures suggest. At some point, you may simply realize that your initial ideas aren't working, and you need to reconsider, which is great because then you're working towards something that does work. Or you may make a mistake or stumble on something accidentally that leads you down a new road. Either way, thinking about these unexpected findings as potential avenues will take you to unexpected and more potentially interesting places. And that's more exciting for you and your audience. 3, use only the best source material you can. Once you're narrowing down your direction, make sure you've got the right image or the right lighting setup for a model or whatever. The less you have to manipulate the elements in your composition in Photoshop, the less forced it'll look and the quicker it'll be to build. And both of those things are of huge benefit to you. 4, try to resist adding fluff. If it's a pig, it's still a pig if you put lipstick on it. A boring cupcake is still boring if you put more sprinkles on it, right? When you're just adding stuff because your compositions feel boring, it's usually because the idea is boring. Ask yourself whether what you're making is really that interesting to begin with. Because when you're working on something interesting, it's probably fairly apparent to you what kind of stuff you need to be making to bring it to life. Now, it's totally fine to struggle with a composition, but make sure you ask yourself whether you're just working it out or if there's actually not enough of an idea to work out yet. 5, let the details and story support each other. You probably only understand your idea or your story kind of vaguely at first, and when you go to visualize it with details, those details may come out with unexpected qualities that may suggest new things about your story. Let that happen if you think it benefits the goals of the project. Let your ideas evolve as you work on them, and always be working toward knowing your story better and crafting details to convey it. 6, aim to add value and inspire your audience. If I haven't said it enough, the real point of storyboarding is to inspire. To inspire the client to do something they hadn't considered, or to inspire the other people on the project to do excited and passionate work. And ultimately, it's to inspire the audience and provide them with something compelling. Storyboarding can really be a stage where a project becomes something instead of just more noise. And that's important because while some briefs come infused with inspiring direction, a lot of the briefs you're handed as a designer are vague at best and uninspired on average, if not altogether ill-considered. And that makes sense because, again, most clients come with business objectives in mind and are looking to creatives to provide the beauty and inspiration to fuel their message. And that gives us, as the creatives, the potential to do something great for an audience. And that's kind of what we all want anyway, right? To make something we enjoy and have it be enjoyed by others. Clients aren't always going to go for your ideas, but you always want to be trying to bring something to the table. So you can see in looking at these images that I'm not exactly the master of these strategies, but they were certainly helpful in getting us this far. If there had been more time, some of that stuff might have been worked out better, and the logic of the story would have strengthened. But we always have deadlines, so we have to know when to put it to bed. So hopefully that was a decent example of a few things, and this was helpful in some way. I'm still trying to figure out how best to make these videos because they're taking me forever, but we'll see how fast I can push out the next one. And if anyone has any specific topics you want to talk about, let me know. And until next time, enjoy!